Brianna Wu, welcome to the podcast.
It's such a pleasure. I'm sorry we had so much trouble finding a time to do this. It was just one disaster after another trying to find the time.
No, I'm so appreciative. And you've been probably one of the people that I've wanted to talk to most over the last several years. I've been following your
Really?
work for a very long time. So I'm so excited for this.
Me? I don't believe that. Yeah, this is the thing about Jews. Y'all are so kind to everyone. So we don't have to start this off. Like, I'm not that important, honestly.
Fair. We can let the listeners decide that. And if you haven't
Okay.
heard of
Yes.
Brianna Wu, you should pause
Yes.
this podcast and just read a little bit about your bio. I'm just trying to figure out where I want it to start, and I want to sort of hit all of the main issues. But you became well known in the Jewish community. I know you became well known in the wider community for Gamergate, which I'll ask you about in a little bit. But at least for the
Yeah.
Jewish community, we're not used to having a lot of allies that are in progressive spaces, especially your identity as a very outspoken trans woman. And we can talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that and how that might have shifted in the last couple of months, just given a lot of stuff that you've been writing. But talk to us a little bit about your connection with the Jewish community and your defense of Israel in the last couple of years at a time when that was not the popular thing to be doing for people in your community.
So, I'm embarrassed to say this. I had not thought much about Israel or Jews or really any of this stuff before October 7th. I mean, I supported Jews. I didn't have anything against y'all. I think most people who aren't anti-Semites don't spend a lot of time thinking about you. So October 7th happened, and I was like, oh wow, this is going to be big. I really should do a little bit of research so I know what the hell I'm talking about. And I just started reading and learning more about the history of how Israel was founded. And he had the Second Intifada, and I guess 1948. Like, it's a really fascinating history. And the more and more I read about this, I was like, no, I'm not remotely pro-Palestine here. Like, the Jews have been attacked, they've had six wars started against them since 1948, six major conflicts. Like, this is people, Israel is imperfect like every other nation, but this is a country that's just trying to survive, and terrorists are trying to kill them. It seemed relatively straightforward to me. And just as a public figure, I felt a responsibility to say what the truth was. Additionally, for me as a trans woman, I don't mind saying, Jews were some of the people that were most helpful to me when I was transitioning. When I was the very first student to ever transition at the University of Mississippi, Jews were my ally. I had a member of the administration come forward, really help me get my name changed, make sure I was treated fairly. If you see a picture of me and you think I pass and look relatively normal, yeah, that's thanks to my Jewish plastic surgeon, Dr. Spiegel, the therapist that helped me get HRT by diagnosing me and talking to me for 5 months. He was Jewish. So, there's the history of it where it's the correct position to take, but there was also a personal stake in it because Jews had been there for me in the times where I was really uniquely vulnerable. So I felt a responsibility, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is the thing about the Jewish community is that historically and in the current world, the Jewish community is extremely socially progressive on everything
Yeah,
from immigration to social issues to LGBTQ rights to minority rights and all of this. And that's why I think this was happening a little bit before October 7th, but it's obviously proliferated in the last 2.5 years of just the allies that the Jewish community thought they have, not just disagreeing with them on policy issue, right? Like, I think there's a separate question of what one thinks about the war and what one thinks about Bibi Netanyahu, right? Like, these are all political questions that we can,
sure.
disagree with reasonably. And even if I tend to be more hawkish or more dovish, we can disagree. But much of what we've seen from the progressive world has just been so vitriolic. And, I just saw right before we started recording, the former mayor of Irvine, California, which is where I live, just posted about the school in Iran that was blown up. And again, it's still unclear if that was an Israeli missile, an American missile, or a misfired Iranian missile. So I'm sure we won't know the actual truth for months. But she took a screenshot of it and wrote, "These pedophiles slash cannibals are finally being unmasked for who they are." And this is a progressive mayor in, a city, or a university city. Irvine's a very diverse place. It's not the biggest city, but it's, not a no-name city either. And obviously, that's not coming from every single progressive, but that's been so much of what I think the Jewish community has gotten thrown at them. And so you stepping into the foray, I mean, there is a reason why every time you're on a podcast with somebody in the Jewish community, they do start off by, thanking you initially. I'm
But
curious
you
on the
don't need
flip.
to thank me. This is what upsets me. I'm not doing anything that's what, like, no one black calls me up when I was like standing for Black Lives Matter. I didn't have like women's organizations calling me when I was taking, during the Me Too movement. Like, I don't understand why y'all have to thank people. It's insane to me. I don't know what has happened to progressives. I don't understand why y'all are held to this double standard. I don't understand why in the social justice discussion, y'all just aren't present. I don't understand why people take and take and take and take and don't give anything. I just feel like I'm living in an upside down world. And I literally can't understand what's happening to the people around me. It's just, I don't understand the obsession with Jews. Like, y'all are cool. Some of your food is a little, yeah, a little mediocre in my opinion, but like, you're fun to hang around with. I vibe with y'all. I just literally do not understand any part of this problem. It's crazy to me.
So now, if you ever end up in California, I'll have to give you some Persian Jewish food, much better than whatever
Oh, okay.
Ashkenazi Jewish food
There we
that you've
go.
had fired your way. So
Fair
sorry you had
enough.
to undergo the Ashkenazi culinary experience. I think here's a little bit of the Jewish psychology. I'll try to psychologize it. Much
Please.
of Jewish politics in the last 120 years has been centered around a premise of we're sort of on an island by ourselves. It's us against the world. Once the
Yeah.
Jewish communities in Western Europe started giving up on European liberalism. So in the early 1800s, Jewish community very optimistic in Western Europe. French Revolution, Jews are now equal rights, and then Germany, Jews were getting equal rights, and England, Jews were getting equal rights. So the early 1800s was an enormously optimistic time. But then anti-Semitism didn't change; it actually got worse, of course, as the 19th century unfolds, and then as we get into the 20th century. And so the Jewish community took a political philosophic turn from we are, part of this, great universalizing, human experience, and everybody's on the same team fighting for all these, human rights to, oh my goodness, it still seems like everybody hates us for whatever reason. We have to sort of, circle the wagons, right? Zionism, in some senses, this philosophy was rooted in, we have to stick out for ourselves because essentially we don't trust any other group to fight for us. And so I think it's just part of the psychology of the Jewish community almost expects to have no allies. And so when there is somebody who is staking their career and their public persona, and, I've read your post, you've gotten, public death threats for this. And so it's not that you're just,
Oh, I've had
oh,
these
maybe
no
you've lost.
jobs show up at my house. I've had them knock on my
Exactly, right. So
door,
we're not just talking about some Twitter followers that you've lost. We're talking about,
No.
real life implications. I think it really does go to the credit of the Jewish community being like, oh my goodness, we didn't even know such a thing was possible. I mean, I'm being a little bit, hyperbolic here.
But this is the question I don't understand. I really think about this a lot. And first there's the anti-Semitism question. I don't understand why throughout all of human history people are obsessed with you. The closest I've come to understanding it is when I went to Israel last year for the first time and I was in Jerusalem. There's something about that land. And I'm not a woo-woo spiritual read your horoscope kind of gal, but there is some energy in that place that is why three of the world's major religions have come from there. Like, it was really special. And I don't know if it's something cosmic and just like everyone's trying to target you or what. But I think beyond that, what I don't understand is why, especially in the progressive world, why we can't understand there's some red in our ledger. When I have put together phone banking operations here in Massachusetts to help get people elected, it's been Jewish friends that I've called to volunteer to have like 100 people at their house making calls. It is Jews that show up for canvassing events. When I've raised money for, LGBT events, Jews have lined up to write checks and because they believe in those rights. And it's just, you can't be in the social justice space working on issues like abortion access, women's rights, or racial inequality, and not meet a lot of Jews. And I fundamentally cannot figure out this problem. Like, why do people take this help and feel no responsibility to give it back? It's bizarre to me.
Yeah, listen, there's going to be no disagreement there. There's a famous I always like telling this to students, but there's a famous rabbinic teaching in the Talmud that is going into the etymology of, Sinai, like Mount Sinai. And, in
Yeah.
Hebrew, the word for hatred is sina. So it sounds a lot etymology like Sinai, even though it's spelled different. And so the rabbis say, why was it called Mount Sinai? And they say, well, because from there, irrational hatred, was spurred into the world. So, it seems
Yeah.
like even 1500 years ago, Jewish teachers were essentially saying, it seems like there's some strange essentialized feature of Jews that just invites anti-Semitism against all rational odds, which is, again, why you have both the right and the left and religious communities and secular communities. And, if you go far enough, into, obviously Nazism and communism both had their own version of anti-Semitism. And so it seems like anti-Semitism is not just one thing. It's going to come out in any ideology, once the dial is turned up enough. I'm
But
curious
I
how,
want to
yeah,
explore this though just a little bit because there's a corollary to that. Because look, one of my strongest memories growing up is someone Jewish grew up, moved into my neighborhood in Mississippi, and I'm sitting there at Thanksgiving dinner, and all the adults are mocking the Jews that moved onto our street. I'm like 8 years old. I don't even know what a Jew is at that point, but I can just sense this evil in the room, right? And, I remember later I went and really read and tried to understand more about it. And for me, I'm a closeted, trans girl at this point. I know what I am. I'm reading about them getting kicked out of like country after country. And I'm like, oh, this actually lines up really well with the history of, trans people. We have been murdered and exiled and, thrown out of multiple societies. I don't understand. Like, I understand that there's something there that makes people hate you. What I don't understand is why there's not that same glue from people that are plugged into this that makes them identify with you. Because, like, I look at October 7th and I see these terrorists like attacking you, and I can't help but think about 9/11 and what happened in this country. I see these people that are obsessed with you, and I can't help but think about these people that are obsessed with trans women right now trying to run us out of public life, or the struggle, in the 80s for the AIDS crisis, how people were literally thrilled to watch us die and thought it was a judgment from God. I don't understand why the opposite does not exist in the masses. And I have to conclude, I think there is a spiritual component to this, but I also think there's a tactical component. And I really feel like in this moment, look, I have friends that work at all the major Jewish organizations. I respect everyone that works there. I'm not someone that's going to come on here and blast them. But I do think it's time. It's, 2 years after October 7th, the war is over, for us to take a breath and go, what is not working about this strategy? And I can tell you, people that are not Jewish don't understand anything about your history. The only thing we ever hear about is the Holocaust. We're deluged with all these conspiracy theories 24/7 on social media. There's got to be a way to engage the public and make them understand what you're up against that isn't just pointing out anti-Semitism and shaming it. I love like pointing out to these crazy things that people do. You had the Green Party candidate literally 2 days ago that's trying to link you to trans healthcare. Of course it's anti-Semitic. That has value. But I think you've got to tell a wider story about the exile from all these countries and just what you're up against if you're looking to change this narrative.
I totally agree. And I've done many episodes, sort of pushing back. Again, I'm also a product of the Jewish establishment nonprofit world. So, I'm employed by many of these organizations, but have not been hesitant to criticize a lot of I don't think anti-Semitism works. I think you're totally right that getting a bunch of people in front of a PowerPoint and telling them about the Holocaust for the 30th time is not going to help. But I think the Jewish community very much is in that internal conversation. I want to throw one theory your way. It's sort of,
Please.
half baked, but, in terms of attempting to answer why there isn't the sort of opposite, overwhelming support for the Jewish community. And I'm curious, I want your honest reaction. And I don't know how much I believe this, but this has been sort of a working theory that I know many people have held, which is as opposed to other minority groups that are sort of, hated on, where you do have an overwhelming support from people who aren't part of that group, at least within both the Christian and Islamic world, where, almost every Jew in the world has historically lived and, lives now. Both Christianity and Islam in some way are built off the edifice of Judaism. Again, we can go down a
Yeah,
whole
of
rabbit hole and
course.
exactly how and where, but both Christianity and Islam accept many of the premises of Judaism, but then they accept additional things that they view the Jews as having explicitly rejected. Now, a couple podcasts ago, I actually had a debate with a Christian professor about why the Jews, rejected Jesus. And it's funny because from the Jewish point of view, the Jews never rejected Jesus. It just wasn't part of the Overton window of acceptance, right? So,
Right.
if I come onto this podcast and I say I was abducted by aliens, 10 minutes ago, I wouldn't then post, Brianna is a abduction denier, right? Or, she rejects that theory,
Yeah.
right? It was never, you never should have accepted it in the first place, right? It was not within your Overton window of reasonableness. But I think from the point of view of the Christian and Islamic communities and subsequently the cultures that they've produced, which is the Western culture, such as Europe and America, even, post-religious, secular American cultural soup is still Christian in nature, right? We have Christmas off every year. We never have, Hanukkah off. Is just the Jews are still there's something right there's something a little bit off when it comes to Jews just because of that history of the Jews are the people who rejected either the Christian tradition or the Islamic tradition, and they should have been the first ones to accept it because they were the original people of the book or God's people or chosen people, like whatever, however you want to frame it. And so I do think that dynamic leads to Jews again having very scant allies in places like the West. The irony is that when you talk to, I visited China a couple of years ago with my family, and we spent a couple of weeks in Shanghai. And Shanghai, famously saved, hundreds, if not thousands of Jews during the Holocaust. And actually one of the biggest yeshivot, so Jewish academies that was in Europe, actually moved to Shanghai for a couple of years before it eventually went to Israel. And the community there, I mean, they are super, philo-Semitic and happy. And it's the same in countries like India. And, I don't want to overstate that too much, but it didn't elude me that these are both cultures that were not Christian or Muslim cultures, right? So they don't have some, historic interaction with the Jewish community in that sense. I'm curious what you think of that theory.
Well, you asked what I think. Yeah, I'm going to tell you the truth. Let me tell you a story. I went back down to my childhood church in Mississippi for the first time in, my God, about 25 years. And I walk in and I sit at First Press in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and I sit in the pew and we're reading the Psalms. And the very first thing is talking about how Israel is sacred and needs to be protected. And, I was literally talking to one of my best friends in the entire world after this. We went and got, lunch together later. And, we were just talking about October 7th. She's not a particularly conservative or democratic person. She's like not very political at all. And she's talking about her faith and how she really believes that the Bible says that Jews are God's chosen people and that we have a right to a responsibility to protect you. She just offered that. I wasn't talking about Israel policy. I understand the feeling. I think that respectfully, I think y'all don't really understand how Christians think and talk about Jews. You bring us closer to some of the most sacred things that we learn about from a very young age. I'm not the churchiest person in the world, but going to Israel and Jerusalem particularly was overwhelmingly like a spiritual experience. So I'm not going to tell you there aren't crazy Christians that think y'all rejected Christ and that the Antichrist is a Jew and all that kind of stuff. They exist, but I don't think that's as major a factor as you believe. I think it's something actually much simpler. I think that when other minority groups get up and advocate for ourselves, I think that we are really unashamed in talking about the hardships that we face. And I think that one of the really big ironies of Israel and Jews is y'all refuse to be victims. It is so inspirational. It is so inspirational. I wish I could give trans women 10% of what you have. But I think in that refusal to be victims and that pride in what you've accomplished, I think there's just something in it that just pisses people off that think you're like two steps down and that's how you should feel about yourself. So I think it's the same thing that makes you successful. I think it's the reason people hate you. That's the best theory I have, at least.
Yeah, no, I'll take it. And yeah, I agree with you that the vast majority of Christians today in 2026 are not the, Jews are, antichrist and all, should be, endlessly maligned for killing Jesus. It's more within the cultural ether of just, I mean, what I imagine, many on the left would say, just in terms of systems, right? Systems of
Yeah.
culture and systems and way of thinking is just, it's happening subconsciously, even at the point where, yes, your average Christian, I mean, I'm friends with many Christians and they've actually been some of the best allies that I think Jews have had in the last
Yeah.
couple of years, but just something societally in terms of, even post-Christian secular Western movements that are still in some way based off of, I think, in inheriting some medieval traditions. And that's where I think some of the anti-Semitism, but I think it is a very interesting conversation. I wanted to go back because, I've just had so many questions to ask you for so many years. So I want to, obviously, if you have anything to add about this, I would love to hear it. But I'm curious how your activism in the last 2.5 years about Israel and the Jewish community, how that has affected your own placement within, right and left politics in America, given the fact that your rise to fame initially was based off of Gamergate, which was a, feminist uprising against a lot of misogyny, I'm guessing right-wing misogyny that was in
Yeah.
online video game spaces. So I'm curious how that's affected your political disposition. I'm guessing you're not exactly welcome at, left-wing spaces now, but I'm also guessing for obvious reasons you're not conservative and everything there. So I'm
No.
curious how you think about politics. And maybe we can even before that go into a little bit about, for those that don't know what Gamergate is and, haven't followed that saga. I think this was 12 years ago by now. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming a lot of my listeners, were probably 7 years old when that happened. So, what exactly happened there and how exactly did you become a relatively household name?
So, about in 2014, there was a really big explosion in the video game industry. Some of us were talking about how women were facing structural discrimination when it came to raising money for video game studios or getting promoted at work or even being employed as journalists. The video game industry just was a boys' club in ways that made it very difficult to be a woman and work there. And some of us started talking out about that. The trolls kind of organized a disinformation campaign, targeted us, and started basically attacking us online, sending death threats, combing through everything we've ever done. I hope all of this will sound familiar to any Jew that's been on the internet since October 7th. It was kind of the prototype example of how we now argue online, which is mobs and personal destruction and controversy. And it resulted in death threats so extreme, the FBI got involved, Congress got involved. There's a Law and Order episode about that. And all that happened to me for just simply saying, I think the video game industry should make more space for women to be treated fairly. One of the things, though, because you asked about my political evolution, we had a theory back then, because this was really when progressivism was really getting white hot. And we thought that by elevating identity to something you were constantly thinking about, am I talking to a woman right now? Actually, am I talking to a trans woman? Am I talking to a trans woman of color? And kind of doing some calculus should like make you decide how oppressed you are. And therefore, it's like the white guys and oh my God, particularly the Jews. The Jews are so privileged. So they've got to be at the bottom of the pyramid. And then a trans black woman who's disabled would be at the very top and should lead the organization. It's kind of crazy when you say it out loud like that. But this was really the idea that we were kind of trying to get out into the zeitgeist. And our intentions were good. We were trying to rectify historic discrimination in the video game industry, which was a problem and continues to be a problem. The thing that gave me pause about this increasingly is I saw our inability as progressives to get anything done. I would see us get hired at video game studios with this particular set of ideas, and they would create very fragile organizations that were instantly devoured by infighting. When I got into politics, I would see this over and over and over again, where progressives just would not win elections and would spend all of their time fighting each other. And, after a decade, the conclusion I've come to is there's something inherently destabilizing and very fragile about progressivism. I think it comes back to what I admire about Jews so much, because I think y'all do face discrimination and oppression. But your response to that is we're going to have to be more educated, we're going to have to work harder, we're going to have to be more strategic, and we're going to have to form really close alliances with one another and get things done as a community. Trans women just flat out don't do that. And I've really come to the conclusion that progressivism, despite some really good ideals, is actually something that is a cancer in the Democratic Party. I think it is making us a perpetual victim. I think it's making us infight. It's making us focus on things that are one off from winning elections. And just one more thing, because I know I've talked for a while, but the story of why I left progressivism is directly in response to October 7th. I was working in a fairly high profile position for a progressive organization that was funded by Google, by the Google people. And, October 7th happened, and I started talking to the people here. And I'm like, well, we understand they're trying to kill these terrorists, right? They're like, no, I just don't think Israel should exist. I'm like, you don't think Israel should exist? Really? They're like, yeah, they did this to themselves. And that was like such a lightning bolt moment for me. I wasn't hyper educated on the history of Israel at that point, but even I knew that like the alternative to Israel existing is everyone there getting Holocausted. It really made me understand that I was working right next to some anti-Semites, and I just never talked to them about this before. The deeper I got into it, the more I realized there is a anti-Semitism that is congenital with progressivism. It's just inherently linked. I don't understand why it is, but there's just something about this movement in the United States. Every single one of these leaders hate Jews and believe a whole bunch of conspiracy theories. So I can't enable that any further.
Yeah, I think in terms of the all or nothing nature of progressivism, which I think, I'm sure it existed before 10 years ago, but that's really where I think you started seeing it and just sort of pushing further and further to the left on a whole bunch of issues. I mean, I wanted to talk a little bit about the trans community because that's obviously been one of the issues that you've been most outspoken about in the last, 10 plus years there as well. I think for the average, I talk to hundreds of students, a year that are from a diverse range of backgrounds and viewpoints and everything from politics to religion and everything. And I think what's so interesting about the national trans debate is it seems like, like a lot of other issues, but it's the 5% of people on each extreme that just take all the oxygen, whereas the average American, I think, has the view of, listen, we're a capital L liberal society. Everybody should be able to do whatever they want individually. And
Yep.
so, everybody should be respected. If I came on and said that actually I prefer you calling me Dan instead of Daniel, right? Like, do it, right? It doesn't matter that legally on my birth certificate it says Daniel, right? So I think, just common human decency there. And I think the problem was the and one can debate if this goes, if this started with the right and then the left had a backlash, or it started with the left and the right wing had a backlash. It could probably go both ways. Obviously, you have a social conservatism that's just anti anything LGBTQ, which probably creates, again, a circling of the wagons of the LGBTQ community to not want to give an inch on
Definitely.
any doubt casted on any of these things. So, transitioning for minors and hormones and women in, trans women in sports and, or trans men in sports and all of these things. And the trans community has essentially had a doubling down of just pushing the strongest position, even if the evidence didn't exactly match up with it on that end. And the average person in the middle is sort of just, well, I don't agree with these, anti-LGBTQ, conservatives that are, anti-gay marriage and anti all these things. Of course, are anti-trans, that's not surprising. But I also don't agree with a lot of modern gender theory that, there's no correlation between biological sex and gender and everything there. So I'm curious how you think
Yep.
about this, because I know you've also gotten it from really both sides on the trans debate as well.
Second, my dog is barking. So let me ask you a question. How long do you think Judaism would survive if anyone could self-ID into Judaism at any time and have full access to your community and speak for your community and redefine your laws? What do you think would happen to Judaism if there was no process to convert?
It probably would not be great. It's actually funny because I
Really
think
think through that. Really, really think through that. What would happen?
you're right. I think it would get watered down. I think that any a centralized feature of what it means to be a part of Jewish culture and tradition would essentially be eradicated. And I think it would create also a very traditional backlash in some set of the Jewish community that
Yeah.
was anti anybody that was advocating for these, lack of borders. What's funny, I mean, the reason I sort of laughed inside when you asked that question, because this actually, in some ways, mirrors a lot of internal Jewish debates between the Orthodox Jewish community and, say, the Reform Jewish community, because the Reform movement
Right.
has watered down or lowered the fence for what it means to convert into Judaism in a way that the Orthodox Jewish community levies all the same accusations that I just brought up to the Reform community. I mean, I have
Yeah.
more complicated feelings on that side, but that's why I had an internal laugh at that question.
But even with that, like Reform Judaism, there's a process you've got to go through, right?
Sure,
There's
sure. There's a process.
education, you know.
It takes months. It's not, not everybody
Right.
gets to join. There's, it's
Exactly.
rigorous. There are people that are checking,
So
some
one of
quality
the
control there. Yeah.
right, one of the things that happened in 2014 in the trans movement is progressives took what was a medical condition with very stringent standards to get through. And they dismantled the medical safeguarding and turned it in. So let me just tell you really directly. When I transitioned, over 20 years ago, I had to go through 3 months of therapy. I met very easily the medical standards, which were much higher than today. I had to go through months of therapy, get that certified with my therapist, who's literally putting his license on the line that he did a good job. I had to go to an endocrinologist that double checked all that work. When I started getting surgery and hormones, I had to go to, not just a therapist, but a literal, psychiatrist to do a deep dive on my entire psychology and talk to them for a long time. It was a really intensive process. What progressives said is, no, actually, you know what? This medical safeguarding is oppression. And they changed the definitions in ways that are just crazy. I will be the first person to tell you that destroying your endocrine system and ruining the parts that create your natural hormones to take, synthetic hormones for the rest of your life, it's great for me. It saved my life. It made me exponentially happier. That's not something to do on a whim. That's not something to go take like Tic Tacs. And they have redefined trans from people like me, the boys that desperately wanted to be girls from a young age and psychologically shattered from the way that the hormones affected our mind and our social role. Like literally, I had anorexia, depression, suicidal ideation. I was a disaster. I was doing every drug I could get my hands on, just trying not to feel anything. That's who the transsexuals were 20 years ago. Progressivism gets involved, and they've turned it to them literally standing in front of the Supreme Court and saying, well, you can change your microgender every single day. And you can decide you're a man one day and go in the women's locker room and then decide you're a woman the next. It is insane. And with the collapse of these medical standards, it means that people that aren't interested in good faith integration with the gender that we're trying to move towards they are getting involved here. So you have people with a sexual fetish for cross-dressing that are going into women's locker rooms now. You have very, very aggressive males that are going and playing in women's sports. And the reason for that is these people are not transsexual the way that we were transsexual 20 years ago. So, my beef with progressives is not just about Israel policy. It's that they have literally endangered the health care that I will literally die without.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. There was just a lawsuit. I'm sure you've been following this. It's been reported on that the first hospital has now been sued for
Yeah.
essentially not having enough, mental health checks and everything. I've talked to friends. Not to harp on too many Jewish stereotypes, but I have way too many friends that are in the medical world and, and doctors in various fields. And I had a friend who is a psychiatrist. I won't say her name, obviously, but she has said that in her unit when she was in residency on the trans community, it was the one time where they felt like it switched from general academic medicine to essentially activism, and there was no
Yeah.
ability to question. And essentially, they were told, if somebody trans is there, right, your job is to sort of, aid them along that path, and you're not supposed to do the hard work of sort of, teasing out, what is the root cause of this and everything there. It's just sort of a maximum treatment first. I mean, do you think things are changing in terms of, obviously the legal, social, and medical are, they're disparate, but they're also all connected here. So do you see anything changing along those lines?
I think it's changing. I don't want to underestimate this right-wing political project to just flat out eliminate us from public life. You have very powerful right-wing forces that are trying to take away hormones from me as an adult. So what you're saying is true. And I just want to give you one stat. In the 90s, our best estimate of natal girls that wanted to be boys is there were 1 in 100,000. 1 in 100,000 trans men in the United States. You can ask any parent in America today how many non-binary or trans men, like girls, think they're boys in their daughter's class, and they're going to know several. Like, this is obviously a social contagion and it's overdiagnosed. This is so clear to anyone that looks at it. But the answer is to change those medical standards and to reinstate medical safeguarding. I really want you to grapple with this because there's an organized political project to dehumanize people like me, to legally revert me to being a man, to deny me access to the women's bathrooms as I'm just going through life, to dehumanize me, and to claim that taking away my medical transition, which literally saved my life, is actually in my self-interest. They literally believe that eliminating transsexuals is the best way to help us. This is a really terrifying ideology. And the problem is we have two extremist political projects here. One is just full of outright bigots, and the other is this progressive fringe that wants to take a very difficult medical issue and apply politics to what should just be a flat out medical discussion.
Yeah, and I think they both give oxygen to the other one. I mean, it's like a lot
Yeah,
of other cases, but the right wing or far right or however you want to classify it that are trying to erase trans people, they are just harping on the most insane iterations of far left trans ideology to explain to you why what they're doing is in your best interest, even though they have never met you. And
right.
on the flip side, the far left activists who are unwilling to grapple with a lot of the issues that you're talking about, even, offering social contagion as, one such root cause as opposed to, the dominant root cause of a lot of young, girls wanting to transition, they would say, well, you're just parroting far right talking points and you're actually giving them oxygen. And so it is one of these cases where, again, I think your average American would not disagree with anything that either of us have said. I mean, they're, in the middle of this. They want individuals to have the personal liberties to do whatever they want and whatever's best for you. And, they don't have strong feel. I mean, most people, just the same as you said that, you didn't know much, the average American doesn't know much about Jews. The average American probably knows even less about trans people. I mean, I have no
Yeah.
idea what it's like to be trans and everything there. And I don't have a dog in the
Oh,
race
it's
other than
awful.
I want people to be happy and I want everybody to reach their, self-actualization and self-potential and be free to do it. And I also, again, worry about an ideology that's getting pushed that can actually have social effect. I mean, I was going to ask you, I was thinking, and I was telling a couple friends over the weekend that I was going to talk to you. And a good friend of mine also just had a baby girl, and so we have a 1-year-old daughter at home. And we were quite literally, when I said that I was talking to you, they also follow your work. He asked me to ask you how you recommend navigating, even raising a young girl in an environment. I live in a pretty liberal city, and so if granted that it is a social contagion, what then? Because I don't want to be the quote unquote bigot who says, well, you're not allowed to go to anyone's birthday if they identify as LGBT, because that doesn't seem right. On the other hand, if it is a social contagion, that's sort of the only way to do it is to maybe send them to a private school where you can very carefully choose who their friends are going to be. And so in my mind, this is a big mess. And so, you can help me
I
solve all my
I
problems.
think it's really hard. I think that's an utterly legitimate thing. Abigail Schreier, she's a friend of mine. She's done excellent research on, young girls just are more susceptible to social contagion. That's just a fact. It's just the nature. I'm sorry, that's just an uncomfortable fact. We saw this with anorexia in the 90s, right? On top of that, I think this doesn't get talked about a lot. So, estrogen is not addictive. No one takes estrogen and goes, oh, this got me so high. Like, you're going to cry more, but it's not addictive. Testosterone is a euphoric substance. There's a reason it's what, Schedule 2, which is literally everyone that takes it feels awesome and feels tons of energy. And that can have a lot of really negative health consequences because it is such a powerful drug. If I were a parent, I'm just going to tell you the truth, and this is going to piss a lot of people off. I, unless my child met the strongest, like identifying from the youngest age, 100% as a boy, I would make them wait until they were 18 on every single part of it. I'd say you don't have to dress anyway, but we're going to use your name, we're going to use your pronouns. You need to discover yourself because the detransition rate for natal girls going through a phase is so sky high. And I would be very selective about putting them around people that believe in this hardcore gender ideology. There is literally no evidence that medicalizing these identities that are basically create your own gender leads to any positive health outcome in the long run. This is a difficult truth, but the science on trans people was based on people like me, boys that wanted to be girls from a very young age and were into men sexually. That's just the truth. And we know a lot about what it does for people like me. It works really well. We never detransition. We are much happier. And I think if you're dealing with any cohort in there that is more complicated, someone that has autism, someone that doesn't have onset until puberty of these feelings, it's just such a different beast that I would be, even as a trans woman, I would be remarkably slow to affirm that. So, does that make sense to you?
No, totally. And I feel like detransition, I mean, I only first heard that word 2 years ago. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure it's been around before, but that's something that, again, your average person, it's so funny because, I'm in the position, I'm, both a rabbi and I teach classes in the Jewish studies department on campus. And so I'm usually the person where somebody will come to me and they'll say, I know nothing about the Israeli Palestinian conflict. Can you help me?
Yeah.
And so I've had to spend a lot of time thinking of, okay, if you have 30 minutes to talk to somebody about this, obviously you can't get every component. So, like, what are the most important things? And I almost feel the same way talking about, the trans issue where, just the average person just knows, again, just so little. And so it's impossible. I read something, I try to read a diverse sorts of news. And so you read right wing media and it seems like the detransition rate is, super high and, everyone's
Uh,
doing it. And then you read left wing media and it's, one or two crazy people that are, that were sort of, never really trans to begin with, and the right wing is just holding up these one or two people as paragons of why the trans movement is evil, and it's just again so impossible to get accurate data here, mixed with the fact that there's always been the suspicion that again this does seem more ideologic than it does scientific, right? Like this to me should just be a medical question that we just don't know the answer to yet in terms of how best to treat it, what the root causes are, all of these things and how to get people the help that they need. But it's
yeah.
taken an ideologic turn in the sense of, I don't even know if I'm talking to a healthcare provider, either mental health or physical health. I don't even know if they're talking from medical data or they're just talking about what they've been told from people that were based in activism. And so
Yeah.
this whole thing is just one sort of mess of confusion. But then you see it does have real effect on people's lives, both, in terms of people trying to strip away your healthcare and also on the other side, worry that, again, I am on campus. I do see a lot of people who are in the spectrum of genders, for lack of a better term. And,
Yeah.
again, far be it from me to tell an individual or to even think an individual is doing it just to fit in or lying to themselves or in some way. But when you have it happen, when you see it hundreds and thousands of times over, there's just something in me that says, that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right that every third person on a liberal college campus is all of a sudden in the last, 8 years, not the gender that they identified with up until they were, 14 or 15. And so, again, it is just this big quagmire.
Us wanting to be the other gender is the defining characteristic of being trans. That's why, like, I'm not trying to upset people. If someone wants to be androgynous and be in between and act that way, look, I grew up with David Bowie. This is not a huge surprise, but it does not make you a transsexual. Like, let me just walk you through my pathology really quickly. I'm like 4 or 5 years old, and I'm starting to realize I'm a boy, and I'm just horrified by it. I'm asking mom why I have those parts. I'm asking her when I'm going to turn into a girl, like in fairy tales. I'm told to suppress these feelings. And, my early childhood is just like, oh, I've got to pretend to be a boy or my parents aren't going to love me. And I'm doing my best to fit in, not well. I'm not doing well at school. I'm not making friends. I'm not talking to anyone. I just literally shut down. And then puberty comes along and my mental health just disintegrates. Like disintegrates. I got all D's and F's for 6 grades. I got all F's for 7th grade. I'd failed and had to repeat it. I had multiple suicide attempts. I got full on anorexia. By the time I was 14, I somehow developed a really close girlfriend and like just best friend. And that girl saved me. I love her. I would do anything for her. And she stabilized me enough that I survived those years. But it's like a tape going on in your mind all the way where you just want to look a certain way and behave a certain way. And the thing is, there's a hormonal component to it because when you get off testosterone and you get on estrogen, it's the first time in your life you can think clearly. And for me, I have worked so hard to make sure that when I'm in a group of women, I fit in well, that I do my hair, that I dress age appropriately, that I'm fitting in socially with them. I've worked so hard to make it as far over to the other side as I can because that's what transsexuality is. This gender queer political project doesn't want to do that. Their goal is to disrupt, not to assimilate and fit in. And I think if you're serious about getting people like me healthcare, I think we need to be able to say these are different groups. And there's not a medical imperative to do this to them.
Mm. Is gender a binary then in terms of the formulation? Obviously transsexual or transgender, you are switching genders, but are you still affirming that there is a binary? You were just born on the wrong side of that binary?
Yeah, I think they're men and women. I have no issue saying I'm a biological male. I think as I go through life, people assume I'm a woman and treat me like a woman. I've been married to a man for 17 years. I think I look relatively good. I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone they need to live according to what I believe. If someone wants to be something in between, that's fine. But we got to be able to tell the truth. And the truth is, there is not good evidence that giving genderqueer, non binary people testosterone leads to better mental health outcomes in the long run. There's actually a lot of evidence that they have comorbidities like social anxiety disorder, depression. This doesn't seem to make a lot of them better. And I think like in the rush to turn a healthcare condition into a political crusade, we've really just not been straight with people about what we know and what we don't know.
Hmm. Okay, so we've been talking for a while. We had a lot of great topics. Is there anything
Yeah,
else that we haven't discussed and that you think about either
yeah.
politics, Jewish
I
community,
I
trans,
want to
any
get
of
a
that?
little spicy. Can we do this?
Please.
So I want to ask you a straight question. And this is your community, it's not mine. But I can tell you what I see from the outside. I am 100% with you that I understand why Jews feel betrayed by the Democratic Party after October 7th. And I understand even today when we're recording this, Gavin Newsom is out here calling Israel an apartheid state. I understand the fury that Jews have with the Democratic Party, and I'm there with you. I'm not going to tell you that's not valid. But I see y'all moving right wing in a way that's really scary to me. And I do increasingly see some of the Jewish public figures that you have advocating for basically eliminating trans women from public life. The Manhattan Institute has been a huge player in these anti-trans politics. And yeah, my question for you is, do you think it's going to be good for Jews in the long run to be associated so strongly with a political party that holds some views that are fairly antithetical to people's civil liberties?
The short answer is it's no. I don't think it's good in the long run. I think reducing Jewish future and protection of the community to either political party is a bad idea. And so I think
Yeah.
going all in on either side, I think is just, foolish. There was an interesting, there was a famous Jewish historian in the early 20th century, Sela Baron, who had this idea that what shifted for Jews in, modern democracy is that the Jewish communities used to, in, pre-modern cases, just try to cozy up to whatever leader was there and disregard, the wider politics around it. And then Jews in the modern democratic era have realized it's not about individual leaders and have, joined systems and ideologies such as, liberal democracy. And I think some of the Jewish community is reverting back to that old system and
Yeah.
saying, well, we can't trust any ideologies or any parties, so we're just going to trust individuals that we think have our best interests, which I think is what accounts for a lot of the sort of knee-jerk Jewish move to the right, liking people like Donald Trump, especially vis-a-vis Jewish things in Israel, while, and again, your question, I think, hit me a little bit personally because I was just at synagogue yesterday and one of the members of the community who listens to my podcast came up to me and he said, you've really become a little bit more right wing, in the last couple of months. And I've been reflecting on that comment. So I think that applies to me also, where simultaneously I feel torn between a universalistic liberal impulse that I know is actually better for everyone, which is, I think, mainstream Democratic candidates, even like, voting for potentially Gavin Newsom in an upcoming election versus, say, Marco Rubio or JD Vance. On the other hand, for narrow right now Jewish centric issues such as the safety of Jewish community on college campuses, which is obviously an issue that
Yeah.
affects me personally. I
Democrats
have
blowing it. Yeah.
yeah, I have felt a lot safer
Yeah.
with Donald Trump and also heard in a way that, again, I think part of it, and I fully recognize this about myself, there is some emotional over rational aspect here where the Democrats were just unwilling to even say 2 years ago, yes, we understand that campuses have become hotbeds of anti-Semitism. We are so sorry. It was sort of a downplaying it and let's not make a big deal about it versus Republicans who, Trump's, they're not doing it because they love Jews. They're doing it because it was a great political issue for them to drive a wedge in. And so yeah, I
I
think
don't know if I agree with that, actually. I don't.
oh, interesting.
No, I don't. I grew up in a right-wing household. I think the average Republican, especially the Christian religious right, literally feels very strongly that Israel should exist. And just by the nature of being more national security focused, just didn't forget about the what happened to us on 9/11 the way that the left did. I think it's very genuine, actually.
Do you think the same thing with Trump as an individual,
Yeah,
like
I do.
outside? Okay,
I do.
interesting. Got
Look,
it. Okay, you see
can
how
I just be honest with you? Like, this is politically incorrect. Israel has kicked some ass in the war. That beeper thing with Hezbollah, that I want to see a 10 episode miniseries about that. Like, y'all are cool. Like, you're
There's a
doing
book.
some
There's a
cool
book by
stuff.
Ronan
Yes.
Bergman, who's now a New York Times journalist. It's called "The Rise and Kill First,"
Yeah.
and it was written before October 7th. But it's about the history of the Mossad and targeted assassinations. Fascinating. I always recommend it to people when I talk to them
I
about
would
this.
love to read that. Text it
But
to
so
me
yeah,
on
so I guess to go
whatever.
back to your question, whether or not one thinks Trump did this because he genuinely likes Jews or was helpful politically, whatever one's opinion on that, Jews have just seen that and I think have gravitated towards that away from a Democratic Party where Jews increasingly are having to fight internally to have their voices heard and concerns met, and also a Democratic Party that seems to be increasingly in favor of kowtowing to opinions that at least I think are outside of the Overton window. So I think, again, with the Gavin Newsom thing that I just heard about an hour ago, right? Calling Israel an apartheid state for me is outside the Overton
It's
window of what
disgusting.
is disgusting. And so therefore that just makes me much more knee-jerk upset than Trump doing 10 things that I think are disgusting that don't affect me. And again, I don't really have a good universalistic moral framework other than a very particular one. In other words, I think a lot of Jews have traded universalism for particularism here in terms of thinking about this. But yeah, I mean, I do think
Yeah.
it is a problem in terms of what it's doing to democracy and what it's doing to general liberalism and what it's doing to separation of powers in America and what it's doing to social policy and, all things that I am much more aligned with Democrats on than Republicans. And even reflecting on, even the repeal of Roe, a couple of years ago, just that alone probably negatively affected more people than, anything positive that Trump has done in terms of helping any group. But I happen to not be a woman who might need an abortion in a red state. I
Yeah.
happen to be a Jew on campus, and I hate to be so selfish about it. I'm not saying this normatively. I'm saying this descriptively. I don't want to think like this, but I think this is how I've started to think, and how I think a lot of the Jewish community is thinking. And so, in some sense, again, it's descriptive, not normative. The Jewish community that has tilted right, their answer to your question would just be, this is just sad collateral damage that I think, has to happen in this fight.
This is cynical, but I've been told by many Jewish friends that voted for Trump that the destruction of my access to civil society, and I just want people to understand let me just go through a list of things that have happened. You have, like, I can't serve in the military anymore. He's changed the rules federally, so I'm legally a man. I can't use the bathroom. There are efforts to um, literally erase all data that could specify trans people because we don't exist anymore. That was an executive order. So no healthcare can be developed for us. No research can be done for us. He's weaponized the federal government to shut down hospitals providing trans healthcare. The culture of the Republican Party is just degrading me, using slurs, calling me a man repeatedly. It is ugly, ugly, ugly stuff. And I've had Jewish friends who've just told me price of doing business. The Democratic
Yeah,
Party is
so
too
I
anti-Semitic.
won't
And
say
I
that.
understand
Yeah.
it. Well, let me just say, I understand that. But like, if all of us take this to the nth degree, what's best for me, Brianna Wu, is if I keep my mouth shut on all this stuff, all the anti-Semitism, and just make sure the Democrats get elected, because that helps me most. Democrats aren't going to take away my health care. They're going to reinstate, undo all these executive orders. So when we've got a Senate candidate in Maine that has Nazi tattoos and is going on podcasts with white supremacists, best for me to just shut up about that and support him anyway. It's best for me to just be like, Calvinism, who really cares? And just be Team Democrat. But that's the way of giving up all our principles. And that's the way of creating a country where you don't feel any responsibility for me and I don't feel any responsibility for you. And this partisan hell we're in, where we can't get anything done because we're screaming at each other nonstop, that problem just keeps getting worse. And I think if you're a principled, intelligent person right now, you've got to do what I've done, which is I am no longer blindly loyal to the Democratic Party. I can't pretend we are not a bunch of anti-Semites in a lot of ways. I can't pretend we're not moral cowards, and I can't pretend we have a great national security strategy. We don't. So when the Democrats blow it, I'm going to point that out. And when the Republicans do something good, like I completely support what Trump is doing in Iran right now, I think it's going to stabilize the region, I'm going to say so publicly. And I think if we can get these centrist people in the middle, they're just focused on getting things that are good for the country and for each other, if we can give each other a little credit, I think that's the way forward. And that's what I intend to do. But I really I have to reject this calculus I see where people like me and my access to civil society is disposable. I need more Jews speaking up against this, if you really believe that. Do you think I should be called a man constantly by this president? Do you think I should like not be able to use the bathroom as I go about my day? Do you think like this medicine that I would literally die if I did not have access to? Do you think that should be taken away? I don't think most Jews want that.
No, of course not. And as you were, until you had mentioned, we need to get more centrist candidates in, I had literally written down to ask you, I mean, if some middle position, I think is the answer here, where if we do assert that Jews, because of everything we've been talking about, have been voting more right wing, I mean, is it mutually exclusive with therefore they've completely given up on helping you? Or is there some middle ground where I think, I do see a lot of Jews who have moved more knee-jerk conservative. Their social positions haven't changed. And so, I know many Jews who held their nose and voted conservative in the last election, but are still extremely in favor of abortion access, right?
Right.
Another one of these issues there. And again, it is one of these tough issues where it was a genuinely tough. I mean, I faced this also. For Congress, we had an enormously close Congress race between the Republican and Democrat side. And the Republican, the Democrat ended up winning, but Scott Baugh, who was the Republican candidate, I talked to him twice on my podcast, and he was, extremely anti-abortion. And this is right when, Roe was being talked about, and this was sort of all the rage. But the Democratic candidate refused to ever meet with anyone in the Jewish community or, not condemn the anti-Israel protesters that were showing up in not student council, sorry, city council every single time, spreading libels. And so for me, again, it was a decision, not an easy decision by any stretch. Eventually, I did vote Republican there. I didn't vote for Trump in the last election because even that was too much for me. But I was reflecting, I mean, and I'm sure you're either connected with him or listen to Sam Harris's podcast over the last couple of years, and him and Bill Maher have always been sort of my two the two people I tend to agree with the most. And
Yeah.
I'm so happy that they both stayed very consistent in the last couple of years and not gotten taken away by this overreach. But what's interesting is I can listen to a 2-hour podcast for Sam Harris, very clearly and rationally delineating all the dangers of Trump. And I totally agree with him, right? Like there's no daylight between what he's saying and me nodding my head. And yet when I see one thing from Gavin Newsom, and again, this is totally irrational. This is totally emotional, saying Israel's an apartheid state. If there was some alternative universe where I had to vote today, Gavin Newsom for president versus Donald Trump for president, it would still be a tough decision. And that's not a rational thing to do. But again, it's just such a knee-jerk reaction of, again, just essentially screw you to the rest of the world. And again, that's not how I want to think. And that's not how a lot of Jews want to think. But I think just that's where Jews have been pushed in some sense. And so I think it
I
is
think it's
helpful
totally
to,
fair.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it is helpful to hear your voice because again, we started off, 45 minutes ago talking about how allyship is rare and why Jews always thank you. Your voice is important in the Jewish community because people like me often forget that people like you exist, not trans people, but left wingers that are or progressives or that are willing to speak up for the Jewish community, because that then does give us a lot more pause when we do vote for politicians that are going to compromise things that you need, even if it helps us in the short term, where if it's a zero-sum game and if, somebody asserts, well, everybody in the LGBTQ rights community just hates us. So in that case, okay, it's still against my, universalistic morals, but I'm going to be less inclined to say, well, but I do still really care about people in this movement. But people like you, I think, are what the Jewish community needs to provide a counterbalance of pointing out, no, the right wing and what they're trying to do here on social issues is also crazy. I mean, I think also I've been very critical of ICE and I've been very critical, I've mentioned abortion a couple times. I mean, these are all issues that I'm certainly more liberal on than the Trump administration. And so it is important to keep hearing those voices. And I keep joking. I mean, you mentioned Mississippi a bunch of times. I've literally been joking with my friends that I feel like I need to spend a month in Kentucky or Mississippi and just talk to, real conservatives in terms of, understanding their worldview, because from the campus point of view, we have, progressives, and then we have liberals, and then we have very intellectual conservative, California conservatives, California Republicans that are sort of a different breed of Republican. And so I'm getting a very skewed vantage point to the American political landscape than obviously if I were to go to Mississippi for a couple weeks, what I would experience there. And I think that might, level us back.
Yeah. I think what I would like to see is, look, when people are out here in my party, like trans women making anti-Semitic statements, I've gone to battle a million times since October 7th. I have. I've destroyed friendships. I've walked away from jobs. I have called people out publicly. Like when I see anti-Semites out there, I let them know this doesn't speak for me. And I say so constantly. What I am looking for is when some of these major right-wing Jewish figures, I would like to see your community push back on this some more. When they're out there dehumanizing me and calling me a man, and suggesting that the best way to help me is to end my health care and to eliminate my civil rights, I'd like to see y'all push back. I understand making the calculus that Donald Trump is more like out of the two choices, that's the one you can make. I understand that. What I don't understand is the silence. And I
Mm.
think if you're going to stand with the Republicans, I think you have a responsibility to speak out against the excesses of that party. And I just don't see y'all doing that.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. And the Orthodox Jewish community, you'd say it's a good Musar. I, I do want to say, I mean, the vast majority of American Jews though are still pretty liberal and don't vote. I mean, even, yes, there is some cohort of Jews that are moving more towards the pro-Trump camp, but the majority of Jewish community would immediately just, I mean, it's still outside of their Overton window to the point where they don't need to condemn it. So if, say,
Yeah.
someone like Ben Shapiro were to get up and make whatever speech about, the transgender community, the vast majority of the Jewish community would just say, okay, he's out there and we don't agree with him on anything. So it's almost
Oh, yeah.
implied that that's sort of a rejection there as well. So that
But I
might
think
explain.
this, I
Yeah.
think our party is going to look, I can tell you this as a Democratic insider. When I went to Israel this year, I sat in, I don't want to say who I met with. It was a very, 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 very high Israeli official. And we sat there and talked, and we actually debated for 2 hours if the Democratic Party was going to become a flat out anti Semitic, anti Israel party. And I argued with him last year and said, no, I do not think that's going to happen. I think this war is going to end. We're going to turn around. I don't believe that anymore. I think Israel and I think support for Israel is going to be something the Democratic Party abandons you on. And I think we're clearly not willing to expel these anti Semites from our ranks. So I think like this is a decision point to be made, right? Like if you're going if you're going to continue working with the Republicans, like do you just not vote? Do you influence the culture? Like what are you going to do? Because this problem is clearly not going to resolve.
I literally did not vote for either Harris or Trump in the last election because of that.
Yeah,
I mean, I literally was sitting there for months debating. I mean, again, I'm in California, so it doesn't actually matter. But, symbolically, I think it
I
does speak to
understand.
this wider issue that we're talking about where there were just disqualifying reasons for both candidates. And,
Did you see what Kamala Harris said like 2 days ago on Iran? It's disgusting. Like, thank God I voted for her. But my God, can you imagine if she was in office right now making this decision that the protesters in Iran would be screwed? And this is really I understand when a communist 20 something doesn't understand national security strategy. She's invited to the briefing. She has no excuse to not understand the stakes here. She has no excuse to not understand forces like, Lebanon expelling Hezbollah, or, there are rumors that Saudi Arabia is going to participate in these strikes as well, which would be massively stabilizing for the region. She has no excuse not to understand this. And she's saying the dumbest thing possible. Like, can you imagine if she was president right now?
no, it'd be. I mean, listen, I'd be lying if I said in the last week I have not been very happy that Trump was president. It sounds
Yeah,
like you are on that path too. And again, this is why I think, especially in a two-party system like ours, there are enough disqualifying reasons for each party. I mean, after 2020, I said that I would never touch any Republican that didn't outright condemn the denial of the election ever again. And then I found myself 4 years later literally voting in Congress for a Republican who he wasn't in office then, but he said nothing against it. Right. It wasn't
yeah,
that he wasn't at the, he wasn't storming the Capitol or whatever. But, when asked on the record, he sort of gave some whitewashed answer of, well, it's, complicated or whatever. Like, no, I don't think it was
it's
complicated. It
not
was
complicated.
insane. Yeah. And I think, just that is disqualifying, I think, for all of political eternity. And yet, the anti-Semitism post October 7th in the Democratic Party is also disqualifying for eternity. So you're right. This is a real problem. And again, it speaks to the fact that there is a real need for a political center of people that, it's not crazy to not be anti-Semitic and not be transphobic. Like
Yeah,
I'm sure those people exist that
most
are
people are not.
tactful
Yes.
enough to enter into the political foray and, whatever the reason, if it's funding, if it's social media, if it's just the only people that are actually able to get elected are people that stake out some crazy extreme position because that's what rallies people. Like whatever the reason is, the electorate is very much not where the average American is at on most of these issues, which is they want to either they don't know, right? I mean, I teach upper division political science classes at UC Irvine, and I'm always shocked at how little about politics these students, and if these students don't know much about politics, okay, for sure the physics students and the chemical engineering students aren't going to know much about politics and what's going on. And so again, the average American just does not know anything about the trans community or anti-Semitism or Israel or how separation of powers work and why it's important that Trump doesn't just govern by fiat instead of, and actually listens to Congress and the judiciary, right? Like all these issues. I don't have any great solutions. Uh, there was
Well,
a
before we go, I want to talk about solutions because, like,
please.
what do you think should be done? Because the thing I've thought so much about this, like, I don't mind telling you, I am not working the midterms for the Democrats. I just can't do it this time. I can't. I really thought after we got our clock cleaned in 2024 that we would sit down and have some meetings and go, gosh, should we have trans women in women's sports? Is that a good idea? Is that fair to women? Maybe we should kind of move on from this one, guys. It's kind of a political loser. I really thought we'd sit down and go, gosh, not calling out the anti-Semites sure made the Jews not show up for us. Look at this polling data. And we've learned nothing. We've learned literally nothing. In fact, we're doubling down on all the stupidest things we've done. So I'm not working this election cycle. I'm working on other things. And as best as I can tell, we have got to have some credible figures that will just say what they are thinking and have some decent values that are American values, meaning your life matters as a Jew and my life matters as a trans woman. And I need respect and you need respect. And there's also responsibility that trans women have. I think we've got to start rebuilding the center and calling out this crazy stuff. And I think we've got to find some way to start incentivizing political candidates that eschew this extremism. I think John Fetterman is an excellent example of this. And, I think for me as a non-Jew, I think there's tremendous value in me talking to other non-Jews and being like, look, here's why Israel is an important ally. Here's why anti-Semitism is really bad right now. I think for whatever reason, when y'all talk about it, I think it just is not heard in the same way. And it's not fair, but I think there's tremendous value in that. And I think what you and I have a responsibility to do is to get out there and start building a culture that does take national security and liberalism in the old school sense, not meaning this inverted hierarchy of oppression, but all of us get respect or none of us get respect. I think that's what we need to be focused on.
I totally agree. Listen, count me in if you're building something. I would love to help that. And I think again, I think the vast majority of people are also aligned with that. And I'm interested, just for listeners that don't know your background as well. You've been a longtime Democratic political strategist, which is
Yeah.
why you said you're no longer working in the upcoming midterms. Just if people are confused where
I
that
worked the
statement
presidential
came from.
election. I'm just not going to work this cycle. I need a
So I
break.
guess someone can
So,
say,
yeah.
why? I guess this is sort of the same debate of whether you try to attack institutions and change from inside versus outside. But does that mean you are giving up in some sense on change from the inside in terms of the Democratic Party?
It means I've been on the front line of the Democratic Party for over a decade. I've worked every election. I just need a break because I don't believe in what we're doing right now. I need some time to figure out how to make changes that matter for the things I believe in. But I hope you can hear me on this. Like, hand to God, I really feel like the Jewish community in America, it's so weird because I'm not a Jew. But I really feel just like the values of the things I believe in, like liberal democracy and respect for other people, but also defending yourself and not being afraid to throw a cruise missile when some people are trying to kill you. I feel a sense of solidarity with you. And I feel like as we're trying to figure out what is wrong with the country, I really wish we could look more to the Jewish community for guidance because yeah, the coolest thing since October 7th has been learning more about y'all. And you're so smart about so many things. I respect how you're not blind to the fact there are crazy Jews out there, but you handle your business in back channel instead of canceling everyone publicly, left or right, which I think is very smart. I think there's a culture of entrepreneurship that I really, really value. I think self-actualization is really valued there. And I think there's a sense that, yeah, people hate us. What are you going to do about it? We still got to get some things done. And I don't know. I really feel aligned with that, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. And again, I know you don't like being thanked, but thank you for all that. And also thank you for your time. This was
But
a
of
great
course.
conversation.
Yes.